A courtroom, a single moment. One man's dignity against unchecked power. Watch this story to the very end, and if it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to support more stories that matter. The Harris County Courthouse in Houston, Texas, had seen thousands of cases pass through its wooden doors, but that Friday afternoon felt different. The air was heavy, thick with tension and anticipation, as if every person in the room could sense something was about to break. At the center of it all sat James Carson, a quiet black man in his late 30s, hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of months of accusations and whispers. He wore a simple gray shirt and dark slacks, nothing flashy, nothing remarkable. That was James, unremarkable to most, but not today. Today, every glance, every stare seemed to fall on him. To his right sat his public defender, flipping through the case files nervously, while to his left loomed the figure that had haunted James from the moment of his arrest, Sergeant Richard Miller. Miller was a tall white man with close-cropped blonde hair and a jawline sharpened by years of authority. His police uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His stance was rigid, his eyes cold, and when he looked at James, it wasn't the look of law enforcement toward a citizen. It was personal. At the front of the room, Judge Robert Henderson adjusted his glasses and shuffled his papers. He was a man of habit, known for his sharp tongue and firm rulings. His black robe fell heavily around him, and his gavel rested nearby like a weapon waiting to be used. The jury sat in silence, their expressions mixed between boredom, curiosity, and unease. They had seen arguments and counter-arguments for weeks, but even they sensed that the storm inside this room was reaching its peak. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Locals filled the benches, whispering rumors about James, about Miller, about the case itself. Some claimed James had resisted arrest. Others said Miller had gone too far. The truth, like always, was buried somewhere in between, waiting to be dragged into the light. Judge Henderson's voice boomed across the hall. "Mr. Carson, you may approach." James stood slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate. He adjusted his glasses, straightened his posture, and walked toward the witness stand. His footsteps echoed across the polished floor, each one pulling the room tighter into silence. As he took his seat, the judge gestured for him to begin answering the prosecutor's questions. But before a single word left James's lips, Sergeant Miller shifted in his seat. His chair screeched slightly, dragging the room's attention back to him. His jaw tightened. His fists clenched. Miller had been glaring at James throughout the entire trial, muttering under his breath, rolling his eyes whenever James spoke. He had made it clear in every small gesture that he believed James didn't belong there, not as a defendant, but as a man. Now, with the courtroom's attention fixed on James, Miller leaned forward, his voice low but venomous. "You think you're smarter than us, Carson?" The words weren't supposed to be heard, but in the silence of the courtroom they carried. A few heads turned. James, still seated in the witness chair, didn't respond immediately. He stared at the floor, breathing in deeply, reminding himself that patience was his only weapon. But Miller wasn't done. He rose from his seat, his shadow stretching across the polished wood. "You're nothing," he spat. "You should have kept your head down when I told you." The bailiff stirred uneasily, but didn't intervene. Judge Henderson opened his mouth to speak, but it was already too late. In one swift, brutal motion, Miller stepped closer and struck James across the face with the back of his hand. The sound cracked through the courtroom like thunder. A gasp rippled across the benches. Someone dropped a pen. Someone else cursed under their breath. James's head snapped to the side, his cheek burning, his lip split. For a moment, he didn't move. The room froze. Reporters fumbled for their phones, some already snapping pictures. Jurors exchanged shocked glances, their composure shattered. Even Judge Henderson, a man of rigid discipline, sat in stunned silence. The officer who was supposed to maintain order had just broken it, right in front of everyone. James slowly raised his head. His cheek was red, his breathing heavy, but his eyes, steady, unwavering, met Miller's with quiet fire. He didn't lash out, he didn't shout. His voice was low, calm, but it carried farther than any scream could. "You can hit me, Sergeant," James said, his words deliberate, "but you can't hit the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every person in the room felt the weight of those words pressing down on them. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in the gallery wiped tears from her eyes. Even the bailiff, who moments before had stood frozen, took a hesitant step forward, as if unsure whether to restrain Miller or simply acknowledge what had just happened. Miller's chest rose and fell heavily. His fists were still clenched, but for the first time his eyes flickered with something other than rage. It wasn't guilt. It was the sudden realization that he had crossed a line too far and there was no turning back. Judge Henderson finally slammed his gavel down. "Order in the court!" "Order!" he roared, but his voice didn't carry authority this time. It carried desperation, an attempt to reclaim control that had already slipped through his fingers. In the gallery, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Phones were lifted higher. Screens glowed as video after video began recording, documenting the moment that would soon travel far beyond the walls of that courthouse. James remained seated, breathing deeply, eyes steady on Miller. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, hadn't wanted this moment, but it had found him nonetheless, and as the buzzing of cameras filled the silence, one truth settled into the air. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. The crack of Miller's hand against James's face still lingered in the air, like thunder refusing to fade. For a heartbeat, the entire courtroom was frozen in disbelief. The jury sat rigid, mouths slightly open. The reporters had stopped writing mid-sentence. Even Judge Henderson, a man who prided himself on control, sat stiff, his gavel raised but useless. Then the whispers began. Gasps, shouts, the scraping of chairs as people stood to get a better view. A woman in the back called out, "Did you see that?" Her voice trembled, as if naming the act would make it more real. Phones lit up across the gallery. Some hands shook as they tried to keep the camera steady, recording every second. Others whispered to their neighbors, the words tumbling over each other in panic and outrage. But James didn't move. He sat there in the witness chair, his lip bleeding, the red mark of the slap burning across his cheek. His hands rested firmly on his knees. His chest rose and fell with steady breath as though inside his heart pounded. Every eye was on him, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to break, to scream, to fight back. Instead, James turned his head and looked straight at Miller. His voice, calm and low, cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. "You can strike me," he said, "but you can't strike down the truth." The courtroom fell into a hush. Even the judge's gavel paused midair. The words carried more power than any outburst could. They weren't shouted, they weren't forced, they were steady, undeniable, like stone laid on stone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "He's right," someone whispered. Another voice answered, "That's going viral." Miller's face twitched. His fists were still balled at his sides, but for the first time there was something behind his eyes. Fear. Not of James, but of what he had just done in front of the world. The silence was broken by the frantic tapping of phones as people uploaded their videos. The bailiff finally moved, stepping toward Miller, his voice hesitant. "Sergeant, please, step back." Miller glared, but he didn't resist. He straightened, jaw clenched, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. His authority, once untouchable, now looked brittle under the weight of dozens of recording eyes. Judge Henderson finally slammed his gavel, his voice booming with desperation. "Order in the court! I will have order!" But order was gone. The jury exchanged glances, some leaning toward each other, whispering furiously. A few scribbled notes in their pads, their pens moving faster than ever before. They weren't just jurors anymore. They were witnesses. Reporters at the front rows were already typing on laptops, their headlines practically writing themselves. Police sergeant assaults defendant in courtroom. James exhaled slowly, the deep breath his grandmother had taught him years ago when fear would grip his chest. His eyes swept the room, not in defiance, but in quiet acceptance. He had not chosen this moment, but now it belonged to him. "Mr. Carson," Judge Henderson said, his voice lower now, as though that he knew his authority was slipping. "Do you require medical attention?" James shook his head. "No, Your Honor." His voice was steady, almost too steady. The judge hesitated, then turned sharply to Miller. "Sergeant Miller, return to your seat immediately." Miller obeyed, though his movements were stiff, jerky. He sat down hard, his jaw grinding, but he didn't say a word. The silence around him felt heavier than any chains. In the gallery, the chaos quieted, replaced by a new kind of stillness, the electric pause before a storm breaks. People knew what they had seen. They knew this was no longer just a trial about James Carson's case. It was about something larger, something raw and undeniable. Whispers broke the silence again, softer this time, but filled with awe. He didn't even flinch. He's stronger than him. This is going to change everything. The bailiff hovered uneasily by the wall, unsure whether to keep watch on Miller or to prepare for the crowd's reaction. James sat back in his chair, the sting of the slap still hot on his skin. He touched his lip briefly, wiped the blood with the edge of his sleeve, and kept his head high. He did not look like a beaten man. He looked like a man who had endured worse and chosen not to break. And in that silence, in that unbearable stillness, something shifted. The courtroom wasn't on Miller's side anymore. The jury wasn't on his side. Even the judge, trying to cling to control, knew deep down that the balance had changed. The people had seen too much. Somewhere in the gallery, the faint click of a post button echoed louder than the judge's gavel. The first video went live. Within minutes, it would spread beyond those walls, reaching phones, televisions, and news feeds across the country. But in that moment, inside that room, it was just beginning. The truth had been struck, but it refused to fall. By the time James Carson walked out of the courthouse that day, the world had already seen what happened inside. The first video appeared on Twitter less than 10 minutes after Sergeant Richard Miller's hand struck James across the face. Shaky, grainy, filmed from the back row of the courtroom, it caught the sound of the slap and James's calm words afterward. "You can strike me, but you can't strike down the truth." The clip spread like fire across dry grass. Within an hour, it had been reposted thousands of times. By evening, it had reached every major platform. TikTok edits with captions in bold red font, Instagram reels with dramatic music added, Facebook posts shared by relatives who rarely commented on anything. Hashtags trended. Hashtag justice for James. Hashtag courtroom assault. Hashtag truth struck back. News stations picked it up next. CNN ran the clip on loop with the headline, Police sergeant assaults defendant in courtroom. Fox News ran it with a panel of commentators debating what it meant for public trust. Local Texas channels had reporters outside the courthouse, shoving microphones toward anyone who claimed to have seen it firsthand. James didn't watch the coverage that night. He sat in his small apartment, blinds drawn, his face still swollen, an ice pack pressed against his cheek. The television stayed dark. His phone buzzed endlessly, calls, texts, messages from people he barely knew. Some were supportive, others were threats. He ignored them all. Instead, James found himself thinking back to the factory floor where he had worked for nearly 15 years, the clang of machinery drowning out thought. Back to his mother's kitchen, where she'd told him over and over that patience was stronger than anger. Back to the day Miller first arrested him, the sneer on his face as he tightened the cuffs too hard, whispering, "People like you don't get second chances." He had believed for a time that silence was survival, but now silence had been broken, not by him, but by Miller's own hand. Across Houston, people began talking. At diners, in barber shops, in church halls, the slap was replayed on phones and retold in whispers. Some shook their heads in anger, others admitted they weren't surprised. It happens all the time, just not always on camera. Meanwhile, Miller tried to defend himself. He told colleagues James had provoked him, that he had felt threatened. But the video told another story. James hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a hand. The only thing violent in that room had been Miller's rage. The police union issued a cautious statement. "We ask the public not to rush to judgment." But judgment was already forming in the court of public opinion. In the days that followed, James's name spread across the internet like wildfire. Strangers sent him messages of support. Civil rights groups reached out, offering lawyers and protection. His quiet dignity in the face of humiliation struck a chord. People compared him to figures from the past who had stood against injustice without raising a fist. At the same time, the hate arrived too. Anonymous numbers texted him, "You'll regret this." Online forums filled with comments calling him a liar, a criminal, someone trying to play the victim. James read some of them at first, then stopped. They stung, but he knew the truth wasn't in those words. It was in the video millions had watched with their own eyes. For Miller, the fallout was swift. Reporters camped outside his house. Neighbors whispered when he left in the morning. His face was everywhere, frozen in the moment before his hand connected with James's cheek. No uniform, no badge could erase what the world had seen. But for James, the attention was overwhelming. He wasn't used to being a symbol. He was just a man who wanted to go to work, pay his rent, and live quietly. Yet now, every move he made seemed to matter to strangers. Every word he spoke was replayed, analyzed, quoted. One evening, as he walked home from the corner store, a woman stopped him on the sidewalk. She was middle-aged, carrying groceries, her eyes wet with tears. "You don't know me," she said, "but what you did in that courtroom, standing tall like that, it gave me hope." James didn't know how to answer. He simply nodded, thanked her, and kept walking. But her words followed him all the way home. Meanwhile, more videos surfaced. Angles from different phones showed the slap from the left, the right, the back of the courtroom. Each one told the same story. James had stayed still, Miller had lost control, the truth was undeniable. Talk shows debated it. Was this a turning point? Would justice finally be served? Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse holding signs that read "Stand with James" and "Dignity over Violence." And through it all, James stayed quiet. He still went to court, still sat at the same table, still folded his hands in his lap. But now, every time he entered, the jury looked at him differently. The judge's tone had shifted. Even the reporters seemed to lower their voices when he passed, as if recognizing the gravity of what he carried. At night, James sat in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. He thought of his mother's voice, telling him, "Truth doesn't need to shout. It stands on its own." He thought of the factory floor, of Miller's sneer, of that moment when the slap fell and silence filled the room. The internet had exploded. The world was watching. And James knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. By Monday morning, the courthouse steps looked different. The same stone columns and bronze doors stood where they always had, but the air had changed. Charged now, watchful. News vans lined the curb, cameras idled on tripods, volunteers handed out water bottles to a growing circle of people holding handmade signs. "Stand with James. Dignity over violence. Truth doesn't flinch." Inside, the tremor from that single slap had finally shaken something loose. The first official move came from the district attorney's office. By noon, a written statement hit every newsroom inbox in Houston. In response to video evidence circulated publicly, the Harris County District Attorney has opened a formal investigation into the conduct of Sergeant Richard Miller inside courtroom 3C. The language was careful, measured, the kind of phrasing meant to keep emotion at bay. But the meaning was unmistakable. The county could not pretend nothing had happened. Not anymore, not on camera, not in front of a jury. When Judge Robert Henderson took the bench that afternoon, his voice carried less of its usual impatience and more of something sober, almost heavy. He adjusted his glasses, glanced once at James, once at Miller, and then spoke for the record. "What occurred in this courtroom last week was unacceptable. The sanctity of these proceedings is not negotiable. This court will fully cooperate with any and all investigations by the district attorney's office. Let it be known, violence inside these walls cannot and will not be without consequence." He did not look away from Miller as he said it. A murmur rolled through the gallery, soft but undeniable. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. The words did not end the crisis, but they drew a line around it. Everyone could see where the line was now. Outside, support moved from sympathy to structure. A coalition of local clergy announced a prayer vigil on the courthouse lawn. A community legal clinic offered to coordinate pro bono assistance. Civil rights organizations, some local, some national, reached out to James's attorney requesting case files, timestamps, rulings. They asked what was needed. They asked how to help. A neighborhood association from Fifth Ward arranged rides for supporters who wanted to attend the next hearing but didn't have cars. In church basements and school gyms, folding chairs were set in circles and people planned. Not in rage, but in stubborn, organized resolve. James felt the tide before he fully understood it. He learned of the DA's investigation from a quiet knock on his apartment door. His attorney, face tired but eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. He heard about the judge's statement from a voicemail his coworker left, the words tumbling over themselves with relief. He didn't seek the spotlight. He never had. But it had found him. And now it came with handshakes and arm squeezes and the kind of eye contact that said, "We see you. We're with you." He thanked people. Carefully, softly, he kept his answers short. When a pastor on the courthouse lawn asked if he'd say a few words to the crowd, James stepped to the portable mic, cleared his throat, and spoke only this: "I don't want this to be about a moment. I want it to be about what's right. Thank you for standing for that." It was not a speech. It was a compass. The noise, of course, did not come only from one side. By Tuesday afternoon, the other current showed itself. Private messages landed in James's phone from unfamiliar numbers. Vague at first, then pointed. You made a good cop look bad. You'll pay for it. Anonymous accounts online accused him of staging the incident, of disrespecting law and order, of playing the victim for fame. Some used his full name with a venom that tried to shrink him. A letter with no return address appeared in his mailbox, just 3 words cut from a magazine and glued to cardstock. Drop the case. James showed the letter to his attorney and then slid it into a file folder. He did not answer the messages. He did not argue with strangers. When his neighbor asked if he was scared, he told the truth. Yes, he said, just not enough to step backward. The prosecutor assigned to the internal review, Assistant District Attorney Linda Perez, moved quickly and publicly. Cameras caught only her comments at the microphones, but word of her pace filtered back through clerks and court officers. She requested the raw footage from every phone that had captured the courtroom moment. She subpoenaed courthouse security video to map the seconds before and after the blow. She met with the bailiff. She requested the judge's notes. She interviewed jurors, not for what they thought, but for what they saw. Her brief statement outside the granite steps was as clipped as the DA's release, but carried a spine. Our mandate is simple. Find the facts and apply the law. No one is above that television did what television does. It condensed, magnified, and broadcast. Local anchors recapped the slap, the silence, the line from James that had already become a refrain. National shows framed him between archival footage of other public reckonings and crisp lower thirds that read a symbol of dignity, and when courts become cameras. Analysts parsed body language. Legal experts debated precedent. A retired judge looked straight into the lens and said, "The courtroom is not a place for force." The robe and the badge both derive authority from restraint. James watched some of it, mostly with the sound low. He turned the volume up for Adia Perez's updates and for Judge Henderson's remarks, then thumbed it back down when the panels began to argue. He wasn't made of marble, the attention pressed on him, but the core of him stayed put, steady, measured, the same center he'd found in the seconds after the slap when the room waited to see who he would become. At the vigil, candles cupped in paper saucers dotted the dusk. A gospel choir began softly near the steps, voices braiding into a sound that wrapped the courthouse in something warmer than anger. People spoke about accountability, about restraint, about the promise that justice could be repaired where it had cracked. A teenager stepped forward and said, "I didn't know you could answer like that." With words, heads nodded, eyes shone. The choir lifted again. Inside, Judge Henderson's docket moved like any other Wednesday. Arraignments, continuances, clean procedural beats, but the gravity of his earlier statement hung in the room. When he called James's case, he read 2 lines for the record. The DA's investigation had been formally opened. The court would preserve all relevant evidence. He looked at James and then at Miller, whose posture was rigid but smaller somehow, his stare no longer the blade it had been. The judge's voice did not rise. It did not need to. This court will proceed under the same rules that have governed it since long before any of us sat here: truth, process, and order. We will honor them. Threats did not stop because a judge spoke. A pair of trucks idled longer than usual on James's block one night. A social media rumor tried to rewrite his past within a dozen angry posts. His attorney forwarded emails from advocacy groups urging him to stay at a friend's place temporarily. He thanked them. He stayed home. He slept with the television off and the phone face down. He woke, made coffee, and came to court on time. Reporters learned quickly that he would not deliver the sound bites they seemed to want. He did not recount the slap. He did not rehearse indignation. Asked what he hoped for, he answered the same way every time. Accountability. And space to live my life. That answer did not shrink his presence. It shaped it. The more he declined to posture, the more the media framed him as something sturdier than a momentary flashpoint. Packages featured him in quiet shots, walking up the courthouse steps, holding the door for a woman pushing a stroller, waiting at a crosswalk with the light blinking red. No defiance staged for effect, no theatrics, just a man who kept showing up. In living rooms and barber chairs and the back booths of diners, people repeated Judge Henderson's line, "Violence inside these walls cannot and will not be without consequence," and paired it with the DA's action. It sounded, for once, like institutions were remembering themselves. It sounded like the door was open for the thing everyone named but rarely saw, accountability with a pulse. Miller's defenders tried to flood the zone. A statement from his union insisted that split-second decisions were being judged in slow motion. But even that phrasing faltered when stacked against the footage. There had been no split-second threat, no lunge, no raised voice to misinterpret. There had been a man seated in a witness chair and a sergeant who chose to cross the room. The narrative bent where the facts would not. By week's end, the turning point had taken its shape, not as a single headline, but as a braid of actions and answers. The prosecutor's office moved. The judge drew a boundary and held it in place. The community organized with patience instead of combusting. Television framed James as a symbol of restraint and resolve, not just harm. And James, under the lamp of an attention he never sought, planted his feet where he had planted them from the start. He did not shout. He did not hide. On Friday afternoon, as the courthouse emptied, James paused beneath the overhang to avoid a sudden sheet of rain. Two men in work boots hustled past. One turned back and lifted his chin in a quiet salute. James returned the nod. No words, no drama, just a recognition passing between strangers that something was shifting, and that they both could feel it. Across the street, a teenager held up his phone and showed his mother the clip of Judge Henderson speaking. "See?" he said. They said it out loud. She squeezed his shoulder and smiled without looking away from the screen. Upstairs, in a fluorescent office, ADA Linda Perez closed a folder, slipped it into a drawer, and drafted the next round of requests. Down the hall, a clerk labeled a digital archive of courtroom footage. In the judge's chambers, a black robe hung from a wooden peg, still and heavy like a flag at rest. And in the slow, patient work of those rooms, in the candles guttering out on the courthouse lawn, in the letters of support stacked on James's kitchen table alongside the one with cut-out words, the turning point held. It had no parade. It had a spine. Television anchors ended their segments with phrases that tried to bottle it. A test for public trust, a moment of clarity, an inflection toward accountability. The words were imperfect, but they pointed in the same direction. James tucked another note into the growing stack on his table and set a glass of water beside it. He stood at the sink, listening to the rain tap the window, and let the sound draw his breath back into rhythm. When the phone buzzed again on the counter, he flipped it over, read the new message, 4 sentences from a high school teacher in Dallas thanking him for showing her students that strength can look like stillness, and replied with 2 words, "Thank you." Outside, the rain softened. Inside courtroom 3C, the custodians finished their rounds, leaving the benches gleaming and the floor scrubbed to a dull shine. The room would fill again soon, with arguments and rulings and the routines of a system that worked best when no one filmed it. But something would be different when they came back. Lines had been drawn. Voices had found their measure. The investigation had a name, a timeline, a case number. And wherever the next step led, it would not lead backward. The morning of Sergeant Richard Miller's trial arrived gray and cool. A thin layer of clouds hung over Houston, dimming the sunlight but sharpening the edges of the courthouse in a way that made it feel taller, heavier, as though the building itself carried the weight of what was about to happen. By dawn, the steps were already crowded. Reporters adjusted microphones. Supporters lifted their signs. Justice for James, no badge above the law, while passing cars honked in solidarity. Inside, the courtroom hummed with a different energy now. It was no longer James Carson sitting at the defense table, bracing against suspicion. Today, it was Miller in the defendant's chair. His once proud uniform was gone, replaced by a dark suit and tie. His hair was less precise, his posture less certain. The badge that had gleamed on his chest only weeks ago was nowhere to be seen. Judge Robert Henderson entered with the same deliberate stride, but when he took his seat, silence fell heavier than before. He glanced briefly at Miller, then at James, who sat quietly on the witness bench. The shift in roles was unmistakable. The accuser had become the accused. The prosecutor, ADA Linda Perez, rose first. Her voice was calm but firm as she addressed the jury. "You have all seen the footage," she began. "This case is not about speculation. It is not about interpretation. It is about what happened in this very room, captured by dozens of cameras and witnessed by every person here. An officer of the law struck a man who posed no threat. He violated the oath he swore to uphold and the sanctity of this court. And today, we ask you to hold him accountable." The defense tried to argue otherwise. Miller's attorney painted a picture of a pressured man, a moment of confusion, a supposed sense of threat. But the videos, played again on the large screen, told a different story. Frame by frame, the jury watched Miller cross the room, watched James remain seated, watched the slap land without provocation. Each angle was the same, each clip undeniable. Then it was James's turn to take the stand. The courtroom held its breath as he walked slowly to the witness chair. He wore the same gray shirt as before, pressed clean, his hands folded calmly in his lap. When the prosecutor asked him to recount what happened, James spoke with the same steady voice that had carried through the silence weeks ago. "I was seated right there," he said, pointing gently toward the witness chair. "I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved. Sergeant Miller approached me and struck me. Perez asked him what went through his mind in that moment." James paused, his eyes lowering briefly before meeting the jury's gaze. "I thought about my mother's words," he said. "She always told me that truth doesn't need to shout, it stands on its own. So I chose not to fight back. I chose to let the truth show itself." The gallery was silent. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors leaned forward, their faces intent. James did not speak with anger. He spoke with dignity, and it carried farther than rage ever could. The defense attempted to rattle him on cross-examination. They pressed him, suggested he had provoked Miller with a look or a smirk. James simply shook his head. "I didn't provoke him," he said softly. "And if a look is enough to justify violence, then none of us are safe." By the end of the testimony, Miller's defense had thinned to threads. The jury saw it, the judge saw it, everyone saw it, When the closing arguments ended, the room held its breath again. The jury filed out, deliberating for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Richard Miller, guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Miller's head sank into his hands. His attorney's shoulders slumped. Across the gallery, supporters clasped hands, tears slipping quietly down cheeks. Judge Henderson's voice carried the final weight. Sergeant Miller, you have disgraced your badge in this court. The law applies to all, even to those sworn to uphold it. You are hereby sentenced to 18 months in county jail and stripped of your position within the Houston Police Department, effective immediately. The gavel struck. The sound echoed like a closing door. Outside, the courthouse steps erupted. Reporters shouted into cameras. Supporters lifted their signs higher, and chants filled the air. But at the center of it, James Carson stepped quietly down the granite steps, his head bowed slightly, his face calm. The crowd turned toward him, applause rising like a wave. Microphones were shoved forward, questions flew. How do you feel? Do you think justice was served? What comes next? James stopped only once, speaking not to the cameras but to the people gathered. Today wasn't about me, he said. It was about what's right. Real strength isn't in a fist. It's in standing tall when someone tries to break you. That's what justice means. The words rippled through the crowd, carried on chants, repeated in headlines that night. James Carson had not shouted, had not demanded. He had stood, and in standing, he had become a symbol. In the weeks that followed, his name appeared in articles, his face on magazine covers. Some called him a hero, others called him a reminder. But James himself returned to his quiet life. He went back to his small apartment, back to his work, back to his routines. Only now, when strangers passed him on the street, they nodded with respect. When children saw him, they whispered his name with pride. The slap that was meant to silence him had instead given him a voice that echoed far beyond Houston. James Carson had proven something simple, something powerful. Dignity cannot be broken by violence, and justice, though slow, can still find its way. A courtroom, a single moment, one man's dignity against unchecked power. Watch this story to the very end. And if it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to support more stories that matter.